I didn't say a single word when my sister filed those papers in court, and everyone in that room thought it meant she had already won. Looking back now, that moment still feels strangely quiet in my memory, like the calm pause right before something heavy finally drops. My name is Daniel Carter, and the day Emily walked into that probate courtroom with a folder under her arm, she looked completely certain that everything our father had left behind already belonged to her. She didn't even glance in my direction as she sat beside her lawyer, confidently straightening the stack of documents on the table like someone organizing receipts after a long shopping trip. The room itself wasn't dramatic or intimidating the way people imagine courtrooms from television shows. It was smaller, almost plain, with fluorescent lights humming softly overhead and rows of wooden benches where a few relatives had quietly gathered to watch. Our Uncle Robert sat near the back with his arms folded, my Aunt Linda whispering something to him as they waited. I remember the clerk asking Emily a few routine questions, and the way she answered with the calm tone of someone who had already rehearsed the entire conversation in her head. She told them she was filing the official probate paperwork for our father's estate, that she had the will ready, that everything was already in order. At one point she even said, almost casually, "My brother understands that Dad trusted me to take care of things." That line made a couple of people turn and look at me. I didn't correct her. I didn't interrupt. I just sat there quietly, watching her speak as if the whole situation had already been settled weeks ago. If you had been in that room, you probably would have thought the same thing everyone else did, that I was the passive younger brother who had simply stepped aside while his older sister handled the complicated responsibilities. Emily had always been good at creating that impression. Growing up, she was the confident one, the organized one, the one who spoke up first in family conversations. When we were kids in Columbus, she was the one teachers praised for being responsible while I was usually the quieter kid who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. By the time we were adults, that dynamic had settled into something almost automatic. Within the family. When decisions needed to be made, people naturally looked toward Emily first. When Dad's health started declining a couple of years earlier, that pattern became even stronger. Emily began managing doctor appointments, handling phone calls with insurance companies, and updating relatives about Dad's condition. None of that seemed suspicious at the time. In fact, I was grateful she was helping. Watching a parent age is uncomfortable in ways most people don't talk about openly, and having someone step forward to organize things can feel like a relief. But over time I started noticing small shifts in the way Emily talked about Dad and his affairs. She stopped saying, "Dad's house," and started saying, "the property." She began telling people what Dad wanted without actually asking him in front of them. And every once in a while, she would make comments that felt oddly final, like decisions had already been made somewhere behind closed doors. I didn't challenge her then either. That might sound strange now, considering everything that happened afterward, but silence can sometimes feel like the safest place to stand when family dynamics start shifting in ways you don't fully understand yet. Besides, confronting someone without proof rarely ends well, especially when the person you're questioning is someone the rest of the family already trusts. So I watched. I listened. I paid attention to the details most people ignored. By the time Dad passed away that winter, Emily had already positioned herself as the one who would handle everything. At the funeral reception, I overheard her telling one of our cousins that Dad had already arranged things so there wouldn't be confusion later. At another moment she told Aunt Linda that she had the will taken care of. Nobody questioned her. Why would they? She sounded confident, and confidence has a way of making people accept explanations without asking too many follow-up questions. But that confidence followed her into the courtroom that morning, and it was written all over her posture as she signed the probate paperwork and slid the documents toward the clerk. The strange part wasn't that she filed the papers. The strange part was how certain she looked while doing it. Because by that point, I had already seen something she didn't know I had seen. And the moment she officially filed those documents, the legal process she had just started was about to do something she clearly hadn't expected. It was about to bring the real will into the open. If you had asked anyone in my family a year before that courtroom hearing who was most likely to handle our father's estate one day, almost all of them would have said my sister Emily without hesitation. That was the role she had slowly grown into over the years, and to be fair, it did not happen overnight. Emily was 2 years older than me, and ever since we were kids growing up in Columbus, Ohio, she had always been the one who naturally stepped into leadership roles. When we were in school, she organized family gatherings, reminded everyone about birthdays, and kept track of things like medical appointments for our parents once they got older. I was never the type who competed with her for that position. I worked as a project manager for a construction company on the north side of the city, which meant most of my days were spent dealing with job sites, timelines, and long hours outdoors. Emily, on the other hand, worked in real estate and had a schedule that allowed her to stay closely connected to family matters. Over time, that difference quietly shaped the way relatives viewed both of us. Emily became the person people expected to take charge of complicated situations, while I became the brother who was assumed to be less involved. At first I did not think much about that dynamic because it seemed harmless. Families fall into patterns, and ours was no different. But things began to change during the last couple of years of our father's life. Dad had always been independent. Even in his 70s he insisted on mowing his own lawn, driving his own car, and fixing things around the house without asking anyone for help. His house sat on a quiet street about 20 minutes outside downtown Columbus, a modest brick place he had lived in for nearly 30 years after our mother passed away. It was not a mansion or anything like that, but it was paid off, and the neighborhood had grown more valuable over time. When Dad started having health issues, Emily gradually became more involved in his day-to-day decisions. She scheduled doctor visits, spoke with insurance representatives, and called relatives to give updates about his condition. None of that seemed strange at first. In fact, I appreciated the help because my job often kept me on construction sites from early morning until late afternoon. But as the months went on, I started noticing a subtle shift in how Emily talked about Dad's life and property. She began referring to his house as if it were already part of an estate that needed management rather than a home he was still living in. I remember one afternoon when we were sitting in Dad's kitchen drinking coffee while he rested in the living room. Emily was scrolling through something on her phone and casually said, "The property is going to need some repairs eventually if we want to keep its value." The way she said it caught my attention because Dad was still very much alive and sitting just a few feet away watching television. I asked her what she meant by that, and she shrugged as if the answer was obvious. She said she was just thinking ahead, planning for the future. That explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but something about her tone felt different. Over the next few months those comments happened more often. During family dinners she would mention how complicated estate paperwork could be, or how important it was for someone responsible to manage legal documents when the time came. Our Uncle Robert once joked that Emily sounded like she was already running a law office, and she laughed in a way that made it hard to tell whether he was joking or accidentally telling the truth. Meanwhile, Dad rarely spoke about his will directly. Whenever the topic came up he would wave his hand and say that everything had already been handled years ago. That was the explanation most of us accepted. People do not usually like discussing their wills with their children, and I respected that boundary. Still, Emily seemed unusually confident about what those documents contained. She would make comments like, "Dad already trusted me to organize things," or, "The paperwork will not be confusing when the time comes." Sometimes she said those things in front of relatives, almost as if she were preparing everyone to expect that she would be the one managing the estate. I remember one family gathering at Aunt Linda's house about 8 months before Dad passed away. A few cousins were there along with Uncle Robert, and the conversation drifted toward finances and property values in the neighborhood where Dad lived. Emily mentioned that houses on his street were now selling for well over $400,000. Someone joked that we should all start being extra nice to Dad because of that. Emily smiled and replied, "Well, someone has to keep everything organized eventually." The room went quiet for a moment after she said it. Nobody challenged her statement, but a few people glanced at me as if waiting to see whether I would respond. I did not say anything then either. Looking back now, I realize that was the moment when Emily's confidence about the will started becoming something more public. She was not just organizing medical appointments anymore. She was shaping the narrative about what would happen after Dad was gone. And the more she repeated those ideas around family members, the more people seemed to accept them as fact. At the time I told myself it was probably harmless. Maybe Dad really had asked her to handle everything. Maybe she was just trying to make sure the process would be smooth for everyone. But the strange thing about confidence is that it can sometimes hide details that nobody thinks to question until much later. And by the time Emily walked into that probate courtroom with those papers in her hand, most of our relatives already believed she was simply carrying out our father's wishes. The first time Emily's confidence started to feel less like organization and more like control was about 6 months before our father passed away, during what she called a family planning meeting. I remember the exact evening because it was one of those early fall nights in Ohio when the air starts getting cooler but the leaves have not fully changed color yet. Emily had invited a handful of relatives to Dad's house for dinner, saying it would be easier to talk about some upcoming decisions if everyone was in the same room. When I arrived, Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda were already sitting at the dining table, along with 2 of our cousins. Dad was resting in his recliner in the living room, watching a baseball game with the volume turned low. The atmosphere felt normal at first. There were plates of food on the table, casual conversation, the kind of family gathering that could have been mistaken for any ordinary Sunday evening. But after everyone finished eating, Emily cleared her throat and said she wanted to discuss a few important matters about the future. The way she said it made the room quiet almost immediately. She pulled out a small folder and set it on the table in front of her. It was not a thick folder, just a few papers clipped together, but she treated it with the kind of seriousness that made people lean forward slightly. She began explaining that Dad's health had been unpredictable lately and that it would be responsible for the family to start thinking about how things would be managed later. None of that was unreasonable. The strange part was how confidently she spoke about decisions that nobody else remembered Dad discussing openly. She said she had already talked with him about organizing the estate, that he had expressed trust in her ability to handle the paperwork, and that she would most likely be managing the legal process when the time came. Uncle Robert nodded slowly, as if the explanation sounded logical. Aunt Linda asked a couple of polite questions about what that meant for the house and Dad's belongings. Emily answered everything quickly, almost too quickly, like someone who had rehearsed the conversation beforehand. She said the house would need to be maintained properly so its value did not drop, that certain accounts would need oversight, and that she would make sure everything was divided fairly once the legal process was complete. I remember sitting there listening carefully to every word she said, waiting to hear Dad's voice from the living room confirming any of it. But he did not say anything. At one point I glanced toward the doorway and saw him still watching the baseball game, completely unaware that his estate was being discussed in the next room like a business meeting. That moment stayed with me because it felt slightly off balance. I asked Emily a simple question that seemed reasonable at the time. I asked whether Dad had actually asked her to manage everything. She smiled in that calm, patient way she sometimes used when she believed someone was missing the obvious point. She said Dad trusted her to handle complicated matters and that he preferred to keep things simple. The way she framed the answer made it sound like questioning her was almost the same as questioning Dad himself. Nobody pushed further after that. Conversations in families often follow the path of least resistance, and Emily had positioned herself in a way that made disagreement feel uncomfortable. Over the following weeks those discussions continued in smaller ways. Emily would call relatives with updates about Dad's health and casually mention that she was keeping track of the legal side of things. She began organizing documents around the house, stacking folders on the kitchen counter and labeling envelopes. If someone visited, she would explain that she was simply making sure everything was prepared in advance so the family would not have to deal with confusion later. From the outside it probably looked responsible. From my perspective it started to feel like she was slowly building authority around something nobody else had actually verified. One afternoon I stopped by Dad's house after work and saw Emily at the dining table with several documents spread out in front of her. She told me she was reviewing information about the property taxes and insurance policies. When I asked whether Dad knew she was organizing those files, she laughed lightly and said, "Daniel, someone has to stay on top of these things." The comment sounded harmless on the surface, but there was an undertone in her voice that suggested she believed the responsibility already belonged to her. Over time, that confidence began shaping the way other relatives spoke about the situation. Aunt Linda once told me she was glad Emily was handling everything because legal paperwork could be complicated. A cousin mentioned that it was reassuring to know someone responsible was organizing the estate. Nobody seemed to question how Emily had become the person officially in charge. The assumption had quietly become fact simply because it had been repeated enough times. I kept observing, the same way I had done my whole life whenever family dynamics started shifting. I did not argue with Emily or accuse her of anything. There was still a possibility that Dad had asked her to handle those responsibilities privately. But the more I watched, the more I noticed how comfortable she had become speaking for him in situations where he was not even present. And that growing confidence was exactly what made the moment in the courtroom months later feel so significant, because by then Emily truly believed the story she had built was already accepted by everyone. The moment that really changed the way the rest of the family saw me happened about 2 weeks after our father's funeral, during a dinner Emily decided to host at his house. By then the house already felt different. The furniture was the same, the pictures were still hanging on the walls, and the familiar smell of Dad's coffee maker still lingered in the kitchen, but the energy inside the place had shifted in a way that is difficult to explain unless you have experienced it yourself. A home that once belonged to someone suddenly starts feeling like a property waiting to be divided. Emily had invited several relatives over that evening. Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda were there again, along with 3 cousins and one of Emily's friends from work named Karen who I had only met once before. Emily said the dinner was meant to bring everyone together after a difficult few weeks, but from the moment I walked through the front door I sensed that she had something else planned. The dining table was set neatly, almost formally, with plates arranged carefully and a bottle of wine sitting in the center. Emily moved around the kitchen with the confident energy of someone hosting an important gathering, greeting people, offering drinks, and making small talk about work and the weather. For the first hour everything felt normal. People shared stories about Dad, remembering old family trips and the way he used to grill hamburgers on summer weekends. Those memories were comforting in a way, but they also carried the quiet sadness that comes after a loss. Eventually the conversation drifted toward practical matters. Someone asked what would happen with the house now that Dad was gone. I remember that moment clearly because Emily had been waiting for that exact question. She set down her glass of wine and leaned back slightly in her chair as if preparing to explain something important. She said that Dad had already taken care of the legal details before he passed away and that the estate process would be straightforward. The way she spoke sounded rehearsed, almost like a presentation she had practiced privately. She explained that the will gave her the responsibility of managing the estate and making decisions about the house and other assets. Several relatives nodded as if this information confirmed what they had already assumed. Then Emily said something that shifted the attention directly onto me. She said that Dad had often mentioned how busy my work schedule was and how I had never shown much interest in dealing with financial paperwork or legal responsibilities. The comment was framed politely, but the message behind it was clear. She was presenting me as the brother who had stepped aside because he was not capable of handling complicated matters. A few people glanced toward me with expressions that mixed sympathy and mild disappointment. It was not an aggressive accusation, but it felt like a quiet public judgment that had already been accepted as truth. Emily continued speaking calmly, explaining that she would make sure everything was handled fairly once the estate moved forward. She said she would keep everyone informed about the house, the bank accounts, and any other property involved. The conversation began to feel less like a family dinner and more like a meeting where decisions had already been finalized without anyone else being present. What made the moment uncomfortable was not only what Emily was saying, but the way the rest of the room reacted. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody asked where the will was stored or when it had been written. Her confidence filled the silence in a way that made it seem unnecessary for anyone to question the details. I remember sitting there quietly, listening to her describe responsibilities she had already claimed as her own. At one point Aunt Linda looked at me and gently asked whether I was comfortable with Emily handling the estate. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of the entire room's attention. For a moment everyone waited for my response. Emily watched me with a calm expression that suggested she already knew what I would say. I could tell she expected me to nod and confirm the story she had been building for months. Instead I simply said that the legal process would reveal whatever Dad had decided. My answer was neutral, but it created a subtle tension in the room because it did not fully support the narrative Emily had just presented. She quickly smiled and told everyone not to worry about technical details because the paperwork would speak for itself once probate was filed. Then she raised her glass slightly and suggested everyone focus on remembering Dad rather than discussing legal matters. The conversation shifted back toward stories and memories, but the tone had changed. The earlier warmth of the evening had been replaced by a quiet sense that something important had just been decided in front of everyone. As the night went on I noticed how confidently Emily moved through the room, speaking with relatives as if the future of the estate was already under her control. A few people even thanked her for taking responsibility during a difficult time. I did not argue with her that evening. I did not challenge her statements or demand to see the will she claimed existed. Instead I continued doing what I had been doing for months. I listened carefully, watched the details most people ignored, and waited. Because by that point I had already begun noticing something that Emily clearly had not realized yet. And the more confident she became in front of the family, the more certain I became that the story she was telling everyone was about to face a very different version of the truth. About a week after that dinner at Dad's house, I went back there alone on a Tuesday afternoon after work. The weather had turned colder by then, one of those gray Ohio days where the sky looks heavy even in the middle of the afternoon. I still had a spare key, and for a moment when I stepped inside the house it almost felt like nothing had changed. The same quiet living room, the same worn recliner where Dad used to watch baseball games, the same stack of mail sitting near the kitchen counter. I told myself I was only there to gather a few personal items and check on some documents Dad had asked me to store months earlier. But if I am being honest, part of me was also thinking about everything Emily had said during that dinner. The confidence in her voice had been so absolute that it made me wonder whether there were details I had simply missed. I started in the kitchen because that was where Dad usually kept his paperwork. He had an old wooden desk against the wall with a couple of drawers that held bills, insurance statements, and things like property tax notices. I opened the top drawer expecting to find the usual envelopes and folders, and at first that is exactly what I saw. Utility bills, bank statements, a small notebook. Where Dad sometimes wrote reminders for himself. But underneath those papers there was an envelope that looked different from the rest. It was thicker, the kind that comes from a law office rather than a regular mailing. The return address printed in the corner caught my attention immediately. It said Henderson and Pike Estate Attorneys. That name meant nothing to me at the time, but the envelope itself looked relatively new compared to the older documents around it. I pulled it out and checked the date stamped in the corner. The letter had been mailed about 6 months earlier, which surprised me because Emily had told everyone that Dad's will had been written years ago and that nothing had changed recently. Inside the envelope there was not a full legal document, at least not the kind that clearly explained everything. Instead it contained a receipt and a short confirmation letter from the law office thanking Dad for meeting with one of their attorneys regarding estate planning. The letter did not describe the contents of the meeting in detail, but it confirmed something important. Dad had visited a lawyer not long before he passed away. I remember standing there in the quiet kitchen holding that piece of paper and thinking about Emily's confident explanation at the dinner table. According to her, the will had already been finalized long ago and the estate plan was simple. But this letter suggested that Dad had been discussing his estate with a lawyer much more recently than anyone realized. I placed the paper back inside the envelope and read the receipt again carefully. It listed the date of the meeting, the name of the law office, and a reference number connected to an estate consultation. The details were small, almost easy to overlook, but they were enough to raise a question that had not occurred to anyone else in the family yet. What if the will Emily believed she understood was not the most recent one? That thought stayed in my mind for the rest of the afternoon. I did not jump to conclusions right away. There were many possible explanations. Dad might have simply been reviewing his documents without making any changes. People sometimes meet with attorneys just to update records or clarify details. But the timing felt significant. 6 months earlier Dad had still been strong enough to drive himself to appointments, and he had always been the type of person who preferred handling important decisions quietly. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Emily's confidence might have been based on information that was no longer accurate. That possibility did not mean she was intentionally misleading anyone. She might genuinely believe she understood Dad's wishes. But if a newer document existed somewhere, the story she had been telling the entire family could change very quickly. I took the envelope home with me that evening, not because I wanted to hide it but because I wanted time to think before mentioning it to anyone. On the drive back to my apartment I kept replaying the conversation from that dinner in my head. The way Emily had spoken so confidently about the will, the way relatives had nodded as if the future of the estate was already settled. At the time I had stayed quiet because I did not have enough information to challenge her. Now things felt different. That single envelope suggested there might be details nobody had considered yet. I decided not to confront Emily immediately. Accusing someone without understanding the full situation would only create unnecessary conflict. Instead I began making a few careful phone calls over the next couple of days. The first was to the law office listed on the envelope. I did not demand information or try to pressure anyone into revealing confidential documents. I simply asked whether my father had been a client there and whether estate planning meetings had taken place during the past year. The receptionist could not share the contents of any legal files, but she confirmed that Dad had indeed visited their office several months earlier for an estate consultation. That confirmation was enough to make one thing clear in my mind. Somewhere in the legal system connected to my father's name, there was a conversation about his will that had happened much more recently than Emily had told everyone. And the moment she decided to file probate papers in court, that hidden detail was going to become much harder to keep out of the process. After confirming that Dad had met with Henderson and Pike several months before he passed away, I knew one thing for certain. Emily's version of the story might not be the full picture. But I also understood something else just as clearly. If I confronted her too early without knowing exactly what Dad had done with that meeting, the entire situation would turn into a family argument before the truth had a chance to come out. So instead of reacting immediately, I did what I had been doing for months. I stayed quiet and kept observing. Over the next couple of weeks Emily continued acting as if the estate process was already under her control. She called relatives with updates about paperwork, spoke confidently about timelines, and even started discussing possible repairs to the house. One afternoon she called me directly while I was driving home from a job site. Her voice sounded calm, but there was a firm edge to it that I had not heard before. She told me she was preparing to file the probate paperwork with the county court so the estate process could officially begin. Then she said something that caught my attention immediately. She said that once the paperwork was filed, things would move quickly and it would be easier if I signed a document confirming that she would serve as the executor of the estate. I asked her what kind of document she meant, and she explained that it was simply an acknowledgement form showing that the family agreed with the arrangement. According to her, it would make the legal process smoother and prevent unnecessary complications later. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but something about the timing made me cautious. I told her I would like to review the document before signing anything. There was a short pause on the phone after I said that. Then Emily laughed lightly, the same way she had during the dinner when relatives asked questions about the will. She said there was nothing complicated in the document and that I was overthinking the situation. She reminded me that Dad had already trusted her to handle these responsibilities and that the paperwork was just a formality. The conversation ended politely, but the tone of her voice suggested she expected the decision to be simple. Later that evening she sent me the document by email. When I opened it on my laptop I noticed that it was exactly what she had described, a legal acknowledgement stating that the heirs of the estate recognized Emily Carter as the executor responsible for managing the probate process. The language was formal and carefully written. But the meaning was clear. If I signed it, I would essentially be confirming the story she had already presented to the rest of the family. I sat at my kitchen table reading through the document several times. On one hand it would have been easy to sign it and avoid creating tension. Most people in the family already believed Emily was supposed to handle everything. Refusing to sign might look like I was causing unnecessary conflict during a difficult time. But the envelope from Henderson and Pike kept returning to my mind. Dad had clearly spoken with a lawyer months before he passed away. That detail meant the estate plan might not be as simple as Emily believed. The next morning I made another careful phone call, this time asking the law office whether they could confirm the name of the attorney who had met with my father. The receptionist told me the meeting had been handled by a lawyer named Michael Henderson, one of the senior partners at the firm. She still could not discuss the contents of any documents, but she explained that estate planning clients often stored updated wills with their attorneys for safekeeping. That information added another piece to the puzzle. If Dad had made changes during that meeting, the most recent version of his will might not even be inside the house Emily had been organizing for months. It could be sitting quietly in a file cabinet at Henderson and Pike waiting for the legal process to begin. Meanwhile Emily continued moving forward with her plans. She called Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert to explain that probate would likely be filed within the next week. She spoke about the estate process as if it were already underway. When relatives asked whether I had signed the acknowledgement document yet, she told them she was still waiting for my response but that she was confident everything would be finalized soon. The pressure around the situation slowly began building. A couple of family members even called me directly, asking whether I planned to support Emily as executor. None of them sounded angry, but their questions carried the quiet assumption that the decision had already been made. Each time someone asked, I gave the same calm answer. I told them the legal process would clarify everything once the paperwork was filed. Some people interpreted that response as hesitation. Others assumed I was simply letting Emily handle the complicated details. Emily herself seemed to grow more confident with every passing day. By the time she officially scheduled the probate filing with the county court, she spoke as if the outcome was already guaranteed. What she did not realize was that the very moment she filed those papers, the court system would begin asking for every valid version of Dad's will connected to his estate. And if Henderson and Pike were holding a newer document in their records, the legal process she was starting might reveal something she had never expected. The morning of the probate hearing arrived sooner than most of us expected. In Ohio, once the paperwork is submitted to the county probate court, the process begins moving through a series of scheduled steps that do not wait for family disagreements to settle. Emily had filed the documents the previous week, and within days the court had scheduled the first official review of the estate filing. I remember waking up early that morning and driving downtown through the quiet streets of Columbus while the sky was still pale gray with the first light of the day. The courthouse building itself was not particularly dramatic, just a large government structure with wide stone steps and tall windows, the kind of place people pass every day without thinking about the personal stories unfolding inside it. When I walked through the security entrance and made my way to the probate department, I could already see a few familiar faces waiting in the hallway. Uncle Robert was standing near the benches with his hands folded behind his back, and Aunt Linda was sitting beside him flipping slowly through a small purse notebook. They both greeted me politely, but there was a cautious tone in their voices that suggested the tension surrounding the estate had reached them as well. A few minutes later Emily arrived with her lawyer. She looked composed and confident, wearing a dark blazer and carrying the same organized folder I had seen her using for weeks. When she noticed me standing near the hallway entrance, she gave a small nod that felt more formal than sisterly. The lawyer beside her was a middle-aged man with neatly combed gray hair who introduced himself to the clerk before taking a seat at the table reserved for estate filings. Several other people from unrelated cases were waiting in the room as well, but the quiet atmosphere made every small movement feel more noticeable. Papers shuffled, chairs shifted slightly, and the low sound of people speaking with court staff echoed softly against the walls. When our case was called, Emily and her attorney stepped forward first. I followed a few steps behind them and sat at the side table reserved for family members connected to the estate. The judge was calm and professional, reviewing the paperwork with the careful pace of someone who had seen thousands of similar filings before. Emily's lawyer explained that Emily Carter was filing to open probate for the estate of our father and that she was presenting what she believed to be the valid will naming her as executor. The judge nodded and asked the clerk to record the information. Throughout that exchange Emily remained completely composed. From the outside she looked like someone simply completing a routine legal process. What she did not know was that the process she had just started had already begun, reaching beyond the documents she brought with her. When a will is filed in probate court, the system does not simply accept the first document presented and close the case. The court is required to consider whether a more recent will exists. That requirement meant any attorney connected to the estate who was holding updated documents could present them once the probate case officially opened. While Emily's lawyer continued explaining the estate details, I noticed something happening near the back of the courtroom. A man wearing a dark suit had quietly entered and taken a seat along the side wall. At first he appeared to be just another attorney waiting for a different case to be called, but after a moment he glanced toward me and gave a small nod of recognition. I had seen his photograph on the Henderson and Pike law firm website the night before. His name was Michael Henderson, the same attorney who had met with our father several months earlier. My attorney, who had agreed to accompany me that morning after reviewing the envelope and confirming the possibility of a newer will, leaned slightly toward me and whispered that the timing looked promising. Meanwhile Emily's lawyer had finished presenting the will she believed was valid. The judge asked whether any family members intended to contest the filing or submit additional information related to the estate. For a brief moment the room went quiet. Emily stood there confidently, clearly expecting the process to continue exactly the way she had planned. Several relatives sitting behind us watched with curious expressions, unsure whether anything unusual was about to happen. That was when my attorney calmly stood up from his chair. He spoke respectfully to the judge and explained that there was reason to believe a more recent will might exist. The words themselves were simple, but the effect inside the room was immediate. Emily turned toward me with a look of confusion that quickly shifted into concern. Her lawyer frowned slightly and began flipping through the documents in his folder as if searching for an explanation. Across the room Michael Henderson rose from his seat and walked toward the front with a thin file in his hand. The tension in that quiet courtroom suddenly felt much heavier than it had a few minutes earlier. Because if the document inside that file was what I suspected it might be, the version of our father's estate plan Emily had spent months confidently describing to everyone was about to face a very different piece of evidence. The moment Michael Henderson stepped forward with that file in his hand, the entire atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted in a way that everyone could feel, even the people who had nothing to do with our case. Until that second, Emily had been standing beside her attorney with the calm posture of someone who believed the process was almost finished. Her lawyer had just presented the will she had filed with the court, the one naming her as executor and giving her full authority to manage the estate. From the outside it looked like a routine probate filing. But when my attorney spoke and explained that another document might exist, Emily's confidence changed into something more uncertain. Michael Henderson approached the front of the courtroom with steady, professional steps and placed the file gently on the clerk's desk. The judge looked up and asked him to identify himself. Henderson introduced himself as a partner at Henderson and Pike Estate Attorneys and explained that he had previously worked with our father on estate planning matters. His tone was respectful and calm, but the words he said next were the ones that made the entire room grow still. He explained that several months before our father passed away, our father had scheduled a meeting at their office to review his will and make certain adjustments. According to Henderson, that meeting had resulted in the signing of a new will that legally replaced the earlier document Emily had just submitted to the court. The judge leaned slightly forward and asked whether the law firm was currently holding the signed original of that newer will. Henderson nodded and opened the thin file he had brought with him. Inside was a neatly prepared legal document bearing our father's signature, along with the signatures of 2 witnesses and the official notary seal confirming the date it had been executed. The clerk accepted the document and handed it to the judge for review. For several seconds nobody in the room spoke. The only sound was the quiet rustling of paper as the judge examined the signatures and the date printed at the top of the will. That date was 4 months before our father passed away. Emily's lawyer immediately leaned toward her and began flipping through his own documents with a quick, focused expression. Emily herself looked stunned in a way I had never seen before. Her earlier confidence had been replaced by a quiet disbelief that seemed to freeze her in place. The judge eventually looked up from the document and spoke carefully, explaining that if the newly presented will was valid and properly executed, it would legally replace the earlier version Emily had filed. Henderson confirmed that the document had been prepared and witnessed according to Ohio state law and that the original had been kept in the firm's secure record since the day our father signed it. The judge then asked the clerk to read the key provisions of the will so they could be recorded into the probate case. As the clerk began reading, the difference between the 2 documents became immediately clear. The newer will did not grant full authority to a single executor the way the earlier version had. Instead it appointed both Emily and me as co-executors responsible for managing the estate together. More importantly, it divided our father's property equally between us rather than placing control entirely in Emily's hands. A quiet murmur passed through the small group of relatives sitting in the back of the courtroom as the details became clear. Uncle Robert shifted in his seat, and Aunt Linda lowered her eyes toward the floor as if realizing how different the situation was from what they had believed for weeks. Emily's lawyer asked for a brief moment to review the document more carefully, but the signatures and dates were already clear. The will had been executed months after the version Emily had presented to the court. That meant it was legally the controlling document for the estate. The judge explained this calmly, emphasizing that probate law required the court to follow the most recent valid will. Emily remained silent while the explanation continued. For months she had confidently told relatives that our father had trusted her alone to manage the estate, but the document now sitting in the judge's hands told a different story. It showed that our father had deliberately updated his plan to ensure that both of his children would share the responsibility and the inheritance equally. Henderson then mentioned one additional detail that our father had included in the document. Attached to the will was a short written statement our father had asked the attorney to keep with the file. It was not a legal requirement, but it explained why he had chosen to update the document. The statement said that he wanted both of his children involved in the estate process so that neither of us would feel excluded or pushed aside. Hearing those words read aloud in that quiet courtroom created a moment that felt heavier than any legal argument. The message was simple, but it carried the weight of our father's intention. The legal process Emily had started by filing probate papers had done exactly what the system was designed to do. It had forced every valid version of the will to be brought into the open. And the document she had never expected anyone to see had now become the one the court would follow. After the judge finished reviewing the new will and explaining that it legally replaced the earlier version Emily had filed, the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted from tension to a kind of quiet realization that settled over everyone present. The legal outcome itself was not dramatic in the way people sometimes imagine courtroom moments to be. There were no raised voices, no sudden arguments, and no scenes like the ones shown in television dramas. Instead there was simply the calm authority of the law doing exactly what it was designed to do. The most recent valid will became the document that guided the estate process. The judge explained that Emily and I would now serve as co-executors, meaning that every major decision regarding our father's estate would require both of our involvement. The property, the accounts, and everything else connected to the estate would be divided equally between us according to the document our father had signed 4 months before he passed away. Emily's attorney requested time to review the document more thoroughly, but there was little room for dispute once the signatures and dates were confirmed. The judge scheduled the next administrative steps for the probate process and reminded both of us that the court expected cooperation between the appointed executors. After the hearing concluded, people slowly began standing from their seats and gathering their belongings. Uncle Robert approached me quietly near the hallway and placed a hand on my shoulder. He did not say much, only that he had not realized there might have been a newer will. Aunt Linda looked at me with an expression that seemed both apologetic and thoughtful, as if she were replaying weeks of family conversations in her mind and reconsidering how quickly she had accepted Emily's version of events. Emily herself remained near the front of the courtroom speaking quietly with her attorney. For the first time in months she looked uncertain about what would happen next. I did not approach her immediately. There was no satisfaction in seeing someone realize they had misunderstood a situation that involved our father's final wishes. Instead, I stepped outside the courthouse and stood on the wide stone steps for a few minutes, watching the traffic move slowly through downtown Columbus. The entire process that had unfolded inside that building felt strangely quiet compared to the weeks of tension that had led up to it. Over the following months, Emily and I worked through the responsibilities of managing the estate together. It was not always comfortable at first. The shift from believing she had full control to sharing authority required both of us to adjust our expectations. But the legal structure our father had created forced cooperation in a way that gradually settled the situation. We reviewed the accounts, arranged for repairs to the house, and eventually sold the property to a young family who planned to renovate it. The process took nearly a year from the day of that courtroom hearing to the final closing of the estate. During that time, several relatives reached out to me privately. Some admitted they had assumed Emily's earlier statements about the will were correct simply because she had sounded so confident. Others said they had not wanted to question her during a difficult time for the family. None of those conversations felt like accusations or confrontations. They were simply quiet acknowledgments that the story people believed at first had turned out to be incomplete. Emily and I eventually spoke about everything as well. Our conversation was not emotional or dramatic. It was more reflective than anything else. She explained that she had believed the older will was still valid because that was the last version she remembered discussing with Dad years earlier. When he met with the attorney months before he passed away, he had not told her the details of what he planned to change. Hearing that explanation helped me understand something important about the entire situation. Sometimes family conflicts do not begin with clear intentions to deceive. They begin with assumptions that slowly become accepted as facts simply because nobody pauses long enough to question them. Looking back now, the most important lesson I took from that experience had very little to do with legal documents or property. It had to do with patience. For months I watched Emily speak confidently about a will that she believed she understood. I could have challenged her immediately, accused her of misrepresenting our father's wishes, and created a conflict that would have divided the family even further. Instead, I chose to wait until the legal process itself brought the truth forward. Silence in situations like that can easily be mistaken for weakness. But sometimes silence is simply a way of allowing the facts to reveal themselves when the time is right. The morning Emily filed those probate papers, she believed the story she had been telling everyone for months was about to become official. What she did not realize was that the very system she relied on to confirm her authority would also uncover the one document she had never expected anyone to see. And in the end, the quiet decision our father made months before he passed away ensured that both of his children would stand on equal ground when the truth finally appeared.